Thank you.
Okay, so here we are for session 2 of our Intro to Judaism class. You need both pages. They are different. So I'm passing around a packet that you'll need to keep. So one, and one more. Here we go. And then if you didn't get first session, let me know. I'll get you taken care of. And I'm also, if you miss a session, I'm recording these, so I know that I have to email 2 of you, and I think there may be more people. I'm not exactly sure, but I'll send out the recording. It's a link, and I was told that the link actually did work. So that was a good thing. You know, no, these are important. These are important things, and I'm trying. This is a new thing for me to actually record these sessions, and so I'll do the best I can with it. And if there's ways, like the first time around, I know that I was kind of like talking with my hands, and that didn't go well for the screen. So I'll try to avoid those kinds of things. Today we're going to be focusing in a lot on kind of the Bible. We're going to talk a little about Judaism in terms of the chosen people, but it's mostly the Bible, different aspects of the Bible, and the differences between the Jewish Bible and the Christian Bible. So for those who were here last time, just were there any questions from last time that were held over that after a little bit of thought and reflection that you wanted to ask? All right, and just so everybody who's watching at home, remember, if you're here in class, you actually get to ask questions, which is really important. And so, first of all, we talked last time about who is a Jew, what makes you a Jew, how do you become Jewish? Anybody can answer. If you're born Jewish, yep. And how can you be born Jewish? If your mom's a Jew, that's according to the traditional notion and understanding. Within the Reform movement, remember, it was a little bit different. How else can you be born Jewish? If either of your parents are Jewish, and what? Nope, and you are raised Jewish, and you're raised Jewish. So if in the Reform movement, either of your parents can be Jewish, or you can be raised Jewish. So that's important. Because remember, you can have a parent, if your mom was Jewish, but while she might be Jewish, there was no Judaism in the home, you only saw Christianity, or you only saw Islam, or you only saw another religion. Even though your mom was Jewish, according to conservative and orthodoxy, you're Jewish, because your mom's Jewish. You might not know anything, but you're Jewish. And in the Reform movement, they say that, well, either of your parents can be Jewish, as long as you have at least one, but you also have to be raised Jewish. And then the other way is conversion to Judaism. And one of the notions of Judaism that we do hear a lot about is this idea of the chosen people. And with regard to the notion of the chosen people, how do we look at that? Right? And in Judaism, on the one hand, we have Jewish chauvinism. You have some Jews that are all about, well, we're the chosen people, you know, and, you know, we're pretty special. You know, I don't know if you heard, we're chosen, right? And people don't necessarily go around talking like that, I hope. However, you do have some people that absolutely have that chauvinistic notion, that idea, that understanding. And you see that not just in the way people think and talk, but you also see that in rabbinic commentary, that Jews are special. And that aspect of chosenness is a part of Jewish tradition. It's not what I personally encourage that we focus on, that we're better than anybody else, because that's not how I look at it. You also see it within rabbinic tradition, that it's more, pardon me, I've got this little allergy cough. No, I'm okay right now, but I will take advantage if I need it. But I appreciate it. It's mostly allergies. It doesn't matter how much water I have. Yeah, it just kind of catches. But the idea of the chosen people from a slightly different perspective is, I think, pretty important and pretty fascinating, which is that you actually have rabbinic tradition that through an interpretation of the Bible, right, through the interpretation of the Torah and specific lines in the Torah, envisions that, well, God basically went around to everybody, all the other peoples, and God said, will you accept the Torah? And one after another, they said no. And then finally, it comes to us. And they're like, will you accept? God's like, will you accept the Torah? And we say, yes. Now, the way this story can be told actually is in a chauvinistic fashion and non-chauvinistic fashion. You heard the non-chauvinistic fashion, but the chauvinistic fashion, where this story is also told, is, will you accept the Torah? And you say, well, what's in it? Well, it says, you shall not murder. Oh, you can't murder? Oh, well, we don't want that. And so there's that kind of a notion as well. So stories can be told both ways. There's one story that can't really be told in a chauvinistic fashion, which is that God finally comes around and asks the Jews if they'll accept the Torah. And nobody was really excited about the Torah before this. And to make sure that the Jews would be motivated, properly motivated, had this idea. Oh, pardon me one moment. Yeah. So you have this notion, I apologize for the delay, that you have all of the Israelites that are standing here, and it says that the Israelites were under the mountain, standing under the mountain, right? Which, for the most part, most people think is it's kind of like at the foot of the mountain. In this story, not so. In this story, God holds the mountain above the Israelites, like a stopper. It's like a stopper. And so the Israelites are here. The mountain is literally above our heads. And God says, will you accept the Torah? And our response is, we will do and we will hear. Like, it doesn't even matter. That's also a quote from the Torah. Na'aseh v'nishma. We will do and we will hear, meaning it doesn't matter what you want us to do, we'll do it, and we'll hear about it later. Like, what do we actually know? Because in this kind of a situation, and it kind of helps to explain, one, you've got like this one way that it's talked about how we're at the, under the mountain. And the other is, how do you explain the Jewish response, Na'aseh v'nishma, that we will do and we will hear? Right? And so the rabbinic storytelling that you see and that we're going to talk about at greater length is really about this idea of taking the text and how do we look at the text and how do we look at what it says and how do we understand it. And there's multiple ways of understanding it. There's multiple interpretations. And in some cases, we can absolutely see the importance of that idea of chauvinism. When Jews were being oppressed, when Jews were being, when it was really, really hard, when they were getting it from all other sides, the idea that they needed to be reminded that you're special, that God cares about you. It may not seem like it, right? Because you also have the idea that, I think it was Jackie Mason who said, if God, if we're the chosen people, then God why don't you go choose somebody else? Like, we've had enough, right? We've been dealing with a lot. And so the idea of chosenness, there are times where you could see where that would be needed and that would be necessary. And then there were times, and I would argue like the time that we're living in now, where we're a little bit more ecumenical. We're a little bit, ecumenical is more of a Christian term, but we're a little bit more open to, interfaith coalitions. And yes, we are special in that we have this incredible history, we have this incredible tradition, and at the same time, we're not saying that other people don't have a right to worship and pray the way that they do. That's actually very Jewish. Like last time I talked about the Noahide laws, right? I think did I not talk about it?
You just barely mentioned them.
Just barely. Basically, there's 7 laws that all people have to follow. From a Jewish perspective, you don't have to be Jewish. There's more than one way to be a good person. And that idea, that's really the thrust of the Noahide laws. And we can talk more in specifics and those kinds of things, but that's the basic idea, the basic understanding. And so to be Jewish, it's not like it's the only way, but there's a few more obligations that kind of go along with it. But another way that I look at chosenness is through that lens of history. Last week we kind of went through this span of history. And we saw the destruction of the temple, and we saw the destruction of the northern kingdom, and we saw the destruction of the second temple. And the idea that Jews continually had to find ways to respond to difficulty and tragedy. If you think about it, the temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. When your temple was destroyed, that means your God died, and that means that we talked about that a little bit, right? That was kind of like the mindset. And then when the second temple was destroyed, because when the first temple was destroyed, a lot of our Bible was actually written when we were in the diaspora. We were in Babylon. A lot of our Bible was written at that point in time. When it comes to after the second temple was destroyed, you had rabbinic Judaism that really kind of filled in. And rabbinic Judaism created the innovation and the ingenuity to allow Judaism to continue to adapt and continue to live and continue to thrive, regardless of what was happening in the world today. And Judaism is just as relevant in the 21st century as it was 2,000 years ago. When the temple, it's 2019, so the temple wasn't destroyed 2,000 years ago, right? But it was coming in a few years. And so the idea that Judaism remains relevant, and not just that it remains relevant, that Judaism, that somehow, in spite of all of these horrible things, that Judaism has survived. That Judaism has not only survived, but it's been a good way of life. It's been a good way of living for thousands of years, in spite of the Holocaust. In spite of, again, we're going to talk about all these different points in time throughout history. In spite of all of these horrible things, that we were able to survive. And I don't have any knowledge that we are special because of what we were forced to endure. But it's hard to see all of the different kinds of things that we've had to go through, and that we've been able to adapt and adjust. And I'm a Reform rabbi, right? We've reformed in different ways over the years. And because of it, we were able to survive as a community and thrive as a community in so many different ways. And I don't know that it explains chosenness, but it's that historical lens is one of the ways that I kind of look at it, not just because it says so in the Bible. Yeah, Amy.
I understand the concept of chosenness, but when I read it, it comes across like you are responsible for this. And I looked at the laws that were initiated through the Torah and how most of our society or good societies, take all those laws into account. So do you not look at it more as this is a responsibility that we have to shine a light on what good humanity is like?
Look, the idea that Jews can be a light to the nations and those which is a little bit of a mistranslation, though. the way that we have something to offer, right? That was very much a part of Reform Judaism, especially as we look at it in the modern world, right? As we're talking about the development of the Reform movement, we're talking about the 1800s, early 1900s. That language was very present, was very, very present. And we can also look at it through the lens that a lot of the laws, like, I mean, don't murder and don't steal, well, they were a part of every legal code ever, right? Like, you don't have a society that says murdering, go for it, right? Like, you don't see that. You don't see that. But I think that there is a lot that within our Bible and within our tradition that we look at and we say, yes, right? Love your neighbor as yourself. Don't hate another in your heart. Care for the stranger, right? All of care for those without power in society. All of these different kinds of things are things that we point to and we look at, and that's very, very important. There are other things in our Bible that are less appealing. If you have a rebellious child, go take them out and murder them. Kill them because they were rebellious, and this is their punishment, right? Somebody gets stoned and killed because he picked up wood on Shabbat. It's also in our Bible, right? So there's a lot that's in there that doesn't really work well for us, that we aren't necessarily so proud of. Look, a lot of the book of Joshua. What's the book of Joshua about? If you've read it, it's one group of people after another that we not only conquer, that we completely obliterate and kill everybody, right? Because that's what we were commanded to do. Now, the book of Joshua is not necessarily historical. However, that was kind of the mind frame and the thinking of what was supposed to happen if God was going to be victorious. And in an age where we have seen and experienced and been the target of genocide, right, that obviously doesn't sit so well. But David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, said that Joshua was his favorite book of the Bible. Not because of the genocide part, because of think about it. He was 1948, right? Israel was fighting for its life. So those kinds of things, are part of, right, all the mixture and everything, every aspect of it. So I guess we can look at chosenness in a lot of ways. And I do take pride in some of the things, like the idea that the American Supreme Court and the American legal system is inspired by Judaism and Talmud and rabbinic ways of thinking. Like, there are aspects of that that's really, it gives you a real sense of pride. But the Bible is, in spite of some people feeling that the Bible is inerrant, right? That it's completely perfect. I see the Bible as a beautiful but flawed document that was created by people, and we're going to talk about that in terms of how we understand God, God in Judaism, God in the Bible, and all of the different diversity that we see there. So, yeah, Pamela.
I find it interesting that my very Christian friends and my Mormon friends, they bring up the chosen people.
Yes.
What about my Jewish friends?
Oh, try wearing a yarmulke around here.
So would you like to comment on that? Because I think that other than Christians, Jews, chosen people, almost more than.
No, look, they read their Bible. No, honestly, no, here's the thing is they don't read all of it, right? But the thing is that the word chosen in English, in the JPS translation, comes up 72 times. So I haven't gone through and seen how many times it specifically is referring to, like, because it could be like, you know, I mean, in Numbers 16, what does it say? It says to rise up, chosen in the assembly. So it's not about the idea of chosenness, but the idea that, you know, that we're chosen, it comes up a few times, right? It's a part of the Bible, and it's something, if their pastor is preaching about it, then yes, they're absolutely gonna make reference to it. And that's not necessarily, you know, a bad thing, but it's just kind of a part of it, and it is one of the ways that it kind of works its way into our society today. I look at that as a lot better than the way that Jews used to be. Instead of, hey, Jews, chosen people, it was, hey, Jews, you killed our Christ. And we're going to go and beat you up, right, because of it, right? There's that kind of a thing. I mean, I prefer people appreciating us as opposed to not. So let me talk about God a little bit, because God, there's a lot of God in the Bible. And when it comes to the names of God, when we start off our Bible and we say, well, first of all, in your Bible, have you seen that God is referred to as kind of God? And then God is also referred to as maybe the Lord, but the Lord is capitalized. Have you seen that in your Bibles? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Has anybody else read the Bible? Yahweh. Okay, so Yahweh. Excellent. And so Yahweh comes from somewhere. All right. So there's all these different names from God. One is, so Yahweh is not actually Yahweh. Yahweh is something that we can't pronounce. So if you say Yahweh, you're actually trying to pronounce something that you shouldn't pronounce. No, this is the four letter. This is also known as the Tetragrammaton. It's basically Yud Hey Vav Hey, which I'm not going to write on the board because we're not supposed to. Well, no, you can write the word like Yud Hey Vav Hey, which is also abbreviated as Yah. Where does the W come from? The W comes from the V in German back in the day. Because it was the German scholars, and so this is where you get the idea of Yahweh, right? But it's not Yahweh, it's Yud Hey Vav Hey, which we don't pronounce because Yud Hey Vav Hey was only pronounced by the high priest, who's the holiest person, on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day, in the Holy of Holies where the temple stood in the holiest place. And so now prior to that, once upon a time when the Bible was written, you would have been able to pronounce it. Everybody probably pronounced it, right? It was God's name. And how would you not know God's name? Of course you knew God's name. But the idea that God's name was holy, was special, was not just a word that you use every day, right? Like the word God. The word God lost something in the 50s. Why do we lose it in the 50s? Because it says, on our money, in God we trust, right? Like it's right there. Right there. In God we trust. And why do we have God on our money? It's a way to combat the communists. I mean, that's really why, if you didn't know that, that's why in God we trust. That's why God is in our Pledge of Allegiance. It wasn't there originally. It's there in the 50s to combat the godless communists. However, I realized that maybe when you purchase certain things, that it's kind of like a spiritual experience. Maybe not like everything, but spending money is not spiritual. The idea that God is on our money is ridiculous. You put God everywhere, especially where it doesn't belong, and it loses something, right? And so we take care of the name Yud Hey Vav Hey. We don't just write it. If it's written down on a sheet of paper, it's supposed to not just be recycled, we're supposed to bury it, right? Like we're supposed to care for God's name. And God has lots of names and lots of euphemisms as a result, right? There's like the idea of saying Adonai. Adonai is a Hebrew word that literally means my Lord. That's what Adonai means. But we use this word, my Lord, every time we see Yud He Vav He. This is how we pronounce it. That makes sense. No, could you just quickly check this, please? I'll put other names of God up on the board. And so Yud He Vav He, you've got Yahweh, you've got Adonai. You also have Elohim. Elohim is fascinating. Elohim is fascinating because it is a plural word. Like the word Elohim, the idea of El is God, but just a generic G-O-D. Now, sometimes it can refer to our God. Hi, come on in, take a seat. And so we've got Yehovah, Adonai, Elohim, El. El means God, but it's kind of like a generic term for God. But if you add like El Elyon or El Shaddai, those are other names, right, of God. El Shaddai. Okay, and so I was talking about Elohim. So Elohim is plural of El. Yeah, sorry. I forgot to bring out. We have them around here if you need them. Oh, it's all right. And so Elohim is one of God's name, but it's one of God's names that is, while it's singular, because it's referring to God with a capital G, it's plural. The im in Hebrew means that it's plural. Why is this the way that it is? We don't actually know. But we know that when we say Bereshit bara Elohim, when God created when God began to create, the idea of Elohim is used with a singular verb. Right, so the verb form is always singular with Elohim. So it's not plural, it's singular. And so you also have other names for God. So these are kind of like all sorts of general names of God. You also have names like Tsur, which is rock. You have, Shalom, actually, is another name of God, Shalom, peace. You have Makom, it's a rabbinic name for God. Makom, which is place. So there's all different names for God. We use God, or we create names for God in lots of different ways, right? And why is that the case? It's because, one word is just not enough, right? So it's almost like, it's not like we have nicknames for God, right? But it's that in different contexts and different ways, right? When are we going to want to use God's name as Tsur, right? Tsur Yisrael, the rock of Israel. When are we going to want to, when we're looking for that sense of solid ground, right? When things are uncertain around us. El Shaddai. Shaddai is actually more of a comforting kind of a notion of God. It's also it's mountainy and also comforting as well. And so you have those two kinds of notions. Again, my Lord, Elohim, there's different reasons. And actually, we were just talking about this yesterday at services, that Adonai and Elohim, rabbis kind of interpret one as being more about the compassionate side of God, and one being more of like the justice, and that aspect of God. So you have these different names, and there's a lot more. There's more than anything else. I want you to know that whether you're coming to services or whether we're talking, or whether we're looking in different ways, you might ask, why are there so many different names for God? And the answer is because there's a lot of names for God. Like there's this tradition of 72 names for God, and there's probably more than that. So there's mystical names for God. Like at each age and each stage of Jewish life, different names were created. So God in Judaism is looked at in all different ways. You do have your traditional notion of God within Judaism. God is all-powerful, God knows everything, God is like everything, right? But then there's more than just that. You have notions of God as, people ask, well, if God knows everything and God's all-powerful and, God can be everywhere, and if God is that amazing, then why do we have such problems with our world? And Judaism also answered that question in very different ways. Like Lurianic Kabbalah, one form of Jewish mysticism, looks at God as broken, that God shattered. Right? There was a shattering of God as when God tried to create the world. So why is our world broken? Because God is broken. And it's our job to help repair the world and fix, and as we repair the world, then we also help to fix God. Right? There's that, and there's all these divine shards, like us, right? Kind of came into the world because that's one way, right, of looking at it and dealing with it. There you have notions of, people with notions that God must not be all-powerful. If God is good and just and all those other positive things, and God could do it, well, maybe God really does need our help, right? There's that kind of a notion as well. And within our Bible, so God in Judaism, there's a lot of different kinds of thoughts, ideas, notions. They're very diverse. They're very, very diverse. There's also the idea, and I should mention that God is everything. That's also a mystical notion, that everything is God. Right? And there's, I think it was Spinoza who, some people could, since he got excommunicated, some people argue whether or not he was a Jewish theologian, but Spinoza's notion, or like one of the metaphors that he uses, is the idea of an ocean. And everything is God. But each wave that comes up for a moment, it lives, it exists, it has its own existence and goes back down. Our lives are like those waves, right? We have distinction for a moment, and then we all go back into God. But we start from God, we return to God, just like a wave, right? And so there's different ideas. And if you were to ask me, well, what does Judaism think about God? Or what does Judaism say about God? I will tell you, it depends, right? Like there's lots of different notions, there's lots of different ways of thinking about that. But this doesn't just start with people like, Maimonides would say that you can't actually say anything about God. You can only say what God is not. You can't say what God is. Because if you say what God is, then you start to define God. And God's beyond comprehension and beyond definition, so you can only say what God is not. And that was, right, like that's a rationalist, right, as opposed to the mystics, right, everything is God, or God might be broken, right? Maimonides has a very different way. That's very much a philosopher's way of thinking about it. Actually, Maimonides might have said just that, but I don't remember specifically.
But would that be along the notion that once you define God, you boxed him in? Or?
Yeah, okay. It is very much along those lines. Well, that, in terms of Maimonides, I don't remember how Maimonides specifically said it, but it is along that line of thinking, right? But yes, I did talk about how, like we were just talking about idolatry a little bit ago, and Abraham Joshua Heschel, who his notion of God, he says, he's 20th century, and he would talk about how when you start to appreciate the sense of awe and wonder that we can have for the world around us, that's the first step towards connecting with God, right? Like there's that kind of, so you've got all these different kinds of things. I want to get through our Bible. And so, because here's the difficulty, or for me, it's not a difficulty. For me, it's what I embrace and I celebrate. As I think about God, what does our Bible say about God? Our Bible is filled with contradictions about God. Our Bible says that you can not see God and live. And then elsewhere in the Bible, people see God and live. They do, right? That's what it says. There's other things. It says that God, we talk about how God is punishing, right? And God is, punishes and how terrible it is, but it's also about how God loves us. And it also says that God wants repentance. Well, God punishes when we do wrong and doesn't give us a chance to repent. But then there's this idea that God only wants us to repent and doesn't want to hurt anybody. Which one is it? Well, it's both in the Bible, right? You have no, for everything that we can say about God, even in terms of creation, right? The stories that we know so well. How does God create the world? That's a question, not rhetorical. How does God create the world? Through speech. Let there be light, and there's light. How else does God create the world? Well, where do we see God's breath? You're right. Into the first man. So in chapter one, it's all about speech. Let there be this, let there be that. And it comes and it appears. And then the second time around, in chapter 2, God forms man out of the dust of the earth. God breathes life in. How different can you get? One is more ephemeral, speaking, and there it is. Now, do we create like that? Yes, we do. We create with our minds. We create through our speech. Right? We create stories. We create encounters. We tell people about our lives. We narrate our lives, but do we create by getting our hands dirty? Absolutely. We create in both ways, right? So, but which God is it? Well, it's both. Everything we see in God, about almost everything we can say about God, when we take a look at God in the Bible, we can also say the opposite, based on what we see in the Bible. Why? Because life is complicated and life is messy. We say that God is perfect in the Bible, right? But what does it say after God creates, or after, right before the flood, in Genesis chapter 6? It says that God regrets that God ever created humanity. Can a perfect being regret? We don't usually put those two things together. Why do we create God in this way? Because God is, not just God, but life is messy. And at certain points in time, we are going to want to approach God, and we're going to need to approach God in one way. We're going to want to know that God is perfect because our life is a mess. Or our life is a mess, and so we're going to want to know that God isn't perfect because, right? Because that might also be what we need at that moment. Maybe we need both. Maybe we need to know that there are consequences to our actions, right? If you do this, then God will grant all of these great things. We need to know that, because how many of us plan? We make plans. And some people really like to plan. And, and that's a good thing, right? Type A personalities, it's not a bad thing. However, life doesn't always work that way. Now, 90% of the time, it does. Right? Like we don't say, I'm not going to study for the test. It's all random. I'll do fine, right? Like we don't do that. We study for the test, and based on what we know and how well we study, we're probably going to get a better grade if we know more stuff, right? But then there's a reason why Job is a part of our Bible also. Job said, Job was a great guy, and he suffered. And he finally cries out to God from the whirlwind, and what does God say? God says, I'm God, and who are you? Who are you to think you could know or understand me? And sometimes life is like that. We don't know, we don't understand. We can feel that sense, that same crying out that Job felt. Same as Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes says over and over and over again, everything is hevel, everything is futile. There are times, that's not a place we want to stay, but there is a reason why it's in the Bible. Right? And so we have all of these different contradictions. Why? Because we need it. Because we might need to approach God in that way. We might need to identify with Job, who is crying out. We might need to acknowledge we can't understand, but we want to understand. We might need to know that if we do the right thing, that good things are going to happen. Right? For every aspect of God that we see within our Bible, the opposite is there, because life is not consistent. I won't say that I'm the enemy of, systematic theology and, rational thinking when it comes to theology, but I'm not a big fan because I think that it destroyed, it taught us that everything is supposed to be rational in life, and life has never fit in. Life has never fit into that square peg. It just isn't that simple. And so it's more honest, in my opinion, to really embrace these contradictions and celebrate these contradictions that are a part of our Bible. And so questions, comments about any of that before I move on to talking about what is our Bible?
So just going back, you were saying with God, you're saying something where he's also.
Well, you have that idea, and throughout Jewish thought, there's this idea of that we are partners with God in a variety of different ways. And you can look at that in terms of basic procreation, right? Like, God may be creating everything, but we have a role to play, right? We have to do something in order to, be part, in that idea of partnership with God in terms of creation. And so there's that notion and that idea that we connect and we partner with God. And then you have the idea that God is more, not just our partners, but God is dependent on us, just like we're dependent on God. God created the world, but God broke it, right, through. And that is an aspect of Jewish mysticism that's a part of that. So it's called Lurianic Kabbalah. Isaac Luria was like around the 16th century, I think maybe 1500s. And so there's going to, in Telushkin's big book on, like the big thick book on Judaism, there'll be a little section on Luria. I think that systematic theology was all about logic and reason. And in the age of reason, like there's a reason why so many people move towards that idea of systematic theology. But if you think about it, if God is ineffable, and that's my personal belief, that God is beyond our comprehension, then how many theologians, how much time did they waste trying to prove God's existence? Right? I mean, that whole idea that we can understand God is something that I have a hard time with in absolute terms. We can have a sense of faith, but let's call it faith and let's acknowledge faith. Let's not call it, this is the way it is. That's the kind of thing. And so systematic theology, if everything is logical and rational, it's trying to force in our Bible, just based on the Jewish Bible alone, which is also the same books as the Protestant Bible, right? How do you say that it is, I mean, again, I embrace the errancy in the Bible, right? I'm not trying to say that it all rationally has to fit together. But at the same time, like Rabbinic Judaism, what does Rabbinic Judaism try to do? Rabbinic Judaism does try to harmonize, but it harmonizes acknowledging that what you see in the Bible, what you see in the Torah in particular, on the surface of it doesn't make sense. So what do? There's a lot of storytelling, right? And we'll get into that. We'll get into that in rabbinic interpretation. If we have time, we'll get to it by the end of this class, and I'll give you a few examples of what that looks like. Any other comments or questions right now? This next part is pretty quick, because this is just basic definitions. But the Tanakh is the name for the Jewish Bible. The Tanakh is an acronym. And so when it comes to what our Bible is, so actually, my cheap chook has to go after the last letter. And so this is a tav, a nun, supposed to be a nun. Lengthen that, shorten that. All right, tav, nun, and kaf. And so the tav stands for Torah. What's the Torah? What? First five books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. Okay. Now, it's actually good that nobody answered me right away, because there are different definitions of the Torah, but that's basically what we're going for right now. Genesis through Deuteronomy. Then second, we have the Torah, then you have Nevi'im. That'll be an apostrophe going down. Nevi'im. How do I do that? Put a dash there. All right, Nevi'im. And so Nevi'im are prophets. And the prophets are, and I'll show you a list of the different people. But Nevi'im are the prophets, and then at the end, the Kaf stands for Ketuvim, which is writings. And so we start off with things like Psalms and other things along those lines. And those are the three parts that make up our Bible. But the Jewish Bible is actually very similar. It has the exact same books as the Protestant Hebrew Scriptures. I want to use Hebrew Scriptures as opposed to Old Testament because of the whole supersessionism thing. You're aware of the supersessionism thing. Supersessionism. Old Testament, New Testament, right? The idea that the new one is better and supersedes the Old Testament. That doesn't work well for me personally. And so I prefer Hebrew Scriptures and Christian Scriptures as far as that goes. But this is the basic outline of the Tanakh. And if you take a look at that second page that you have, and so if you are not with me in present, you're going to take a look at this awesome sheet of paper that I'm not going to hold up the whole time, but you will get via computer, and you'll be able to go through that. And so what you see is that if you take a look at the Protestant, quote-unquote, Old Testament, and you take a look at the Tanakh, so the right column and the middle column, or left column in the middle column, you will see the exact same books. However, they're in a different order. The order is very, very important. Why are they in a different order? What?
They're grouped by the name, they're grouped by writings and prophets.
Sort of, kind of, maybe. I mean, you see, right? We start off and we're the same. We've got Deuteronomy, and then you've got Joshua, you have Judges, but now Ruth. Ruth is right there in the Protestant Old Testament right after Judges. Ruth is down in the writings in the Jewish Bible. All right, but then you have 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, and then you have 1 and 2 Chronicles in the Protestant Hebrew Scriptures. 1 and 2 Chronicles are at the end of the Jewish Bible, right? And you notice that the Catholic Hebrew Scriptures and the Protestant Hebrew Scriptures, they are similar, but I did kind of highlight the books that the Catholics have that are more than what you see within the Protestant tradition and what you see in the Jewish tradition. The highlighted ones.
The Maccabees are the one.
Well, think about it. The Catholic Bible was canonized prior to the Protestant Bible, right? That makes sense, right? Okay. And so the Protestant, in the Protestant tradition, they chose to keep books out. See, let's talk about canonization. Canonization is a radical process. What do I mean by that? It is a process of saying this is holy and this is not. Which, if you think about it, is a pretty radical kind of a notion. And so these extra books, what are they called? They have a name called the Apocrypha, which is over there. Right? The Apocrypha are books, and there's another collection called the Pseudepigrapha. Right? And the apocryphal writings are writings that didn't make it into the Bible. And Pseudepigrapha is another great name that has other writings that didn't make it into the Bible. And so you have several different books, and actually it's very interesting because some of these books are actually mentioned, right? The books of Maccabees. There is clearly some knowledge about them, right? And they work their way into aspects of Jewish tradition, but the Maccabees didn't make it into the Bible. And there's a reason for it. When I talk about Hanukkah, I'll explain why the books of Maccabees didn't make it into the Bible. But so you do have these notions and these ideas that are really, really important. But the books are in a different order. Why are the books in a different order? Because of theology. The last book in the Catholic and the Protestant Hebrew Scriptures is Malachi. Malachi is a prophet. Does anybody know what comes at the end of the book of Malachi? Not expecting anything, but just in case someone knows. At the end of the book of Malachi. Yes, way to go. All right, so that is, I will send Elijah the prophet on this great and terrible day, and Elijah will turn the hearts of children to parents, parents to children, right? I mean, it sounds really nice, but then there's also this whole idea of like burning the evil people and this, that, and the other. And it is basically foreshadowing the coming of the Messiah. And then what comes next in Christian scriptures?
John the Baptist, considered.
Mark, right? Is it Mark or Matthew that's first? Matthew. All right, so there you go. So you have the birth of Jesus, right, with Matthew, right? And so that is done intentionally. What are the prophets prophesizing? From a Christian perspective, they're prophesizing the coming of Jesus. And so they ordered the Bible to reflect that. The prophets are prophesying Jesus. We read Malachi, and then We jump right into Jesus. I mean, it makes sense, right? It's logical. Now, we also, the Jews, it's not like there's not an ideology there also. We've had a rough time of it. Our temple was destroyed, and we read about, our Bible tells of the horror and the tragedy of the loss of the temple. And so what happens at the end of 2 Chronicles? Emil? I'm just kidding. And so at the end of 2 Chronicles, does anybody know? Everybody loves Chronicles, right? Favorite book of the Bible, yeah? Okay, I'm joking.
Well,
But
if you get to looking at it, and because of all the kings, it is exciting
there you
when
go.
you really get it.
And so at the end of 2 Chronicles, you basically have this idea that we get to go back and rebuild the temple. That even though our temple has been destroyed, God has not forsaken us. That there is a note of redemption, right? And this is very much a part of the way that the Jewish Bible is structured as well, right? So there's an intention that goes along with all of it. And now, some of it is intended to be historical. Some of our Bible does reflect aspects of history, such as the destruction of the temples in particular. You do have not just the destruction of the temples, but some of our interactions with other kings and other kingdoms, right? There is aspects of history that are reflected within our Bible and that are intended as history. A lot of our Bible is not that way. The 7 days of creation, and then like just a few, like the next chapter, like it talks about the first rainfall, right? And vegetation coming up from the ground. Vegetation came up from the ground after man was created in chapter 2. That's not how it works in chapter 1. Right? And then you also have things, one of my favorite questions, this gets into a little bit of the rabbinic, Judaism rabbinic interpretation, but you have this, some of this is just a great example. What gets created on the first day? First day of creation. What gets created? Day 1. Let there be light, right? Light gets created. Where does light come from? Sun gets created on day 4. So, first day of creation, where's light from? This is why we need rabbinic interpretation. So, all right, so let me first of all just, I think I got everything except for the Haftarah. So one of the things I wanted to mention is that each part, the Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, each part of our Bible is considered to be sacred and special, and we incorporate it into our service. On Saturday mornings, when we have a minyan, we will read out of the Torah. And to read out of the Torah is, actually, this Saturday we've got a bar mitzvah, if y'all can make it, if it works. 10 a.m.? 10 a.m.? Saturday? Yep. Be about 10 to 12. And so it's a nice thing to be able to come and see and witness. We'll read out of the Torah. Nevi'im, the prophets. We take, so we have a few chapters, and we go in order right, when we do the Torah reading. And the Nevi'im, the prophets, will take a selection from the prophets that usually connects to the Torah reading in some way. And that will be our Haftarah reading. Haftarah is not half a Torah. A lot of Jews that think that way, especially kids. But it's not half a Torah. It is a selection from the prophets that often complements and some would say completes the Torah reading. And then there's Ketuvim. And there's parts of Ketuvim that make their way into the liturgy, like Psalms, for example. And so each part of the Bible is important enough to incorporate into our regular liturgy on a regular basis. Well, there's one reading from the Torah, there's one reading from the prophets, and then Ketuvim are a part of the liturgy itself. It doesn't get a special reading, right? But like on the Sabbath day, Psalm 92, the Psalm for Shabbat, is going to be one of the Psalms that are offered. In the morning service, we're going to offer Psalm, there's, it's traditional to offer Psalms 145 through 150. And so, we'll do, one collection of Psalms, and we'll do another Psalm. So we do different Psalms as a part of it. And there's other aspects as well. So it's a way to say that all the different aspects of the Jewish Bible see enough importance to be included in the in our liturgy as a part of our daily or weekly recitations. Okay, so any other questions about that kind of stuff before I get into Rabbinic Judaism?
So you're saying also basically Christians, with their interpretation of the Old Testament going to Malachi, basically. Because you have to preach who departed, for instance.
Oh, well, here's the thing is that I think that it's important to acknowledge that in Judaism, as well as in Christianity, as well as in most any religion, anything that you say is sacred. There's probably a reason why. There's probably a reason why you structure it in the way that you do. And these are choices. These are choices that are made. It doesn't have to be this way. Right? And that's really, really important in terms of understanding it from that logical, right? This isn't like it, the choices are about what will help to create that sense of faith, right? There's a subliminal message. There's an ideology that's a part of it. It's a part of the Jewish Bible and it's a part of the Christian Bible. Whether you look at the words of the Bible as being written by God or man or woman, the ordering of those words are done by man, right? I mean, and this is evidence because you have different orders. You have different decisions about what was holy and what was not holy, right? These are choices that were made, right? Just like within Christianity, we'll talk about it, right? Choices were made to understand Jesus as the Son of God, or maybe not the Son of God, but as divine himself, right? Or as a part, that was a choice that was made. The idea of transubstantiation, that when you eat the communion, that you're actually eating Jesus's body and drinking Jesus's blood. That was a choice that was made, that was rooted in faith. But it's not like, I'm not trying to be cynical about it. Like, the choices are made for a reason. And it's to help bring, the hope was that these choices would help bring people closer to God. But they're choices that were made. So, and within Rabbinic Judaism, you see, I mean, the same kind of choices get made as well, right? Because you have this notion, this idea that Abraham heeds God's call, goes from one place to another, goes into the land of Canaan, and all sorts of different kinds of things happen. But our rabbis, they ask questions like, where did the first light come from? They ask questions like, why Abraham? What was so special about him? And so what our rabbis do, and what rabbinic interpretation is it says the Torah, the Bible, is really important. Our rabbis understood the Torah itself as God's word. right? This came from God. And that is still today, right? The traditional understanding within Judaism. And yet there were so many questions. There were so many aspects of the tradition that needed a sense of clarification, such as, are we really going to do this to our children if they are rebellious? Right? There were so many things that needed a sense. Well, it says that you're supposed to rest on Shabbat. But what does that mean? What does it mean not to do any work on Shabbat? And so Rabbinic Judaism basically filled in a lot of gaps. There was a notion of, and we'll talk about the idea of two Torahs. There's the written Torah, which is the Bible, and then there's the oral Torah. The understanding was that Moses received both on Mount Sinai. The written Torah was what's written down. The oral Torah was every question that would ever be asked ever by anyone. And Moses got all of that on Mount Sinai. And Moses imparted a lot, but some of it got forgotten, right? It was passed down according to tradition. It was received on Sinai. Yeah. And even more troubling that some of our rabbis point out as well, which is that Moses wrote about his own death. That's also a part of it, right? There's all sorts of questions that get asked about this. But in terms of the traditional rabbinic interpretation, without looking at, like anything else, but you got to understand this, right? That you have this idea of two Torahs, the written Torah and then the oral Torah. And the oral tradition is the one that helped to fill in all of the gaps. And so it was our rabbis basically having this chain of tradition, right? It's understood as a chain of tradition that gets passed down from generation to generation. And so the rabbinic teachings that they're offering from a traditional rabbinic understanding is that those teachings have been passed down basically since Sinai. There isn't a lot of evidence for that. In terms of actual evidence, if Sinai would have happened around 1200, right, you have our rabbis do their best to try to fill in the gaps about what the prophets knew. But there's still a gap between the prophets and our first rabbis. And so our rabbis created an institution, or it's talked about this idea of the men of the Great Assembly. But there's no historical evidence for the men of the Great Assembly, right? What historically probably happened? Historically, our rabbis needed a sense of legitimacy, right? They went back to Sinai with oral tradition. But what did they do? They were trying to understand what God wanted and what God expected, right? That was the idea. And so what happens, right? I mean, you understand what I'm saying, right? There's tradition and how it's understood in tradition. And then if we put on, right, a scholar's hat, it doesn't take away from the faith, in my opinion. I don't need it to go back to Sinai. I can appreciate the rabbis for being the brilliant people that they were. Because what did they do? They said, how do you rest? How do you not work on Shabbat? So they created 39, or it's listed in the Mishnah, 40 minus 1, 40 less 1. So 39 categories of work that you're not supposed to do on Shabbat. And so what did they do? They took this amorphous, this lack of understanding, this lack of knowledge, like how do we do this? And they filled it in. And they tried to get rid of all the gray areas. And so what did they do over the course of the next, 1800 plus years? They defined what those 39 categories of work were. And it says that you can't harvest on Shabbat, because that would be work. And so it kind of, then you shouldn't really cut anything, because that could be construed as work. And so that's why you can walk through a grassy field on Shabbat, but you can't run through a grassy field on Shabbat. No, you can run, just not through a grassy field. Why? Because if you walk through a grassy field, you're just kind of walking. You're not really doing anything. You're not intentionally. There's no intention that goes along with anything along those lines. The friction between your shoes and the grass may inadvertently cut something, but if you run through a grassy field, well, it's going to happen, right? And so therefore, but that kind of, like, there's that level of detail. You're not supposed to cut. You're not supposed to tear. So there are many Orthodox communities that will pre-cut toilet paper.
As they did where I was.
Yeah, but think about this. Well, yeah, but this is very, very practical.
And they pre-pull diapers.
Yeah.
They pull the tab where it has to be pulled off, to make it sticky.
Yeah. No, but this is really practical, because you're not supposed to work on Shabbat.
No writing.
Right? You're not supposed to write, and so you can, but they talk about it. Well, what if you accidentally, right? So you can write one letter, but not two. There's a logic to it. There's a lot of it that really does make sense. And so why Abraham? So on the one hand, actually, before I get to why Abraham, let's talk about light, right? Like God creates light. So what was the light? The light was the light of righteousness, according to some rabbis, that God hid away and is hiding away until the time of the Messiah. Right? That's one interpretation of the light that God created on the first day. And in general, you see that kind of come up more often than anything else. But you also have you have a hyper literal reading of some of the texts as well, such as there was evening, there was morning, the first day. So when did Jews begin the day? In the evening. Evening comes first. There was evening, there was morning, right? So evening comes first. So Friday night starts the Sabbath. Our new day is going to begin in, a few hours when the sun sets, right? We say, right, the Shema. We're supposed to say the Shema twice a day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your being. Set these words which I command you this day upon your heart. Set these words which I command you this day upon your heart. Teach them faithfully to your children. Speak of them when you're at home and on your way, when you lie down and when you rise up. Say these words when you lie down and when you rise up. So our rabbis actually have a debate about what this means. Should every time I lie down, do I need to say these words? Or is it more metaphorical? And there's a story to prove that it's actually metaphorical of a guy who lies down, says the Shema. While he's saying the Shema, he's distracted and doesn't see the bandit on the road, and he gets mugged. And this is actually proof to show that it's actually in the Talmud. It is kind of proof that we actually understand this more metaphorically. Before you go to bed, and you wake up in the morning, that's when you should say the Shema. You say it twice a day. Why? Because, again, same. You shall inscribe these words on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Why do we have a mezuzah? Right? A little box. And inside the box is these words of Scripture that are put in the box and put on your door or on your doorpost.
The Shema, that's written in
That first paragraph, yeah. And so there's this hyper literal way of looking at it. But then there's also, again, the storytelling. So why Abraham? And so now some people who haven't come from a Jewish background have actually heard this story before. And so, because it's a great story. Why Abraham? So when Abraham was a kid, so the rabbis tell the story. They're trying to understand why was Abraham so special. And so when Abraham was a kid, his dad owned an idol shop. That was a good profession, right? And he was an artiste, right? And so he creates these idols, and Abraham's looking at them, and he's thinking like, why are we creating these idols? You're just a whole bunch of stone, right? And so he gets kind of fed up. His dad leaves him in charge of the shop one day, and Abraham goes and he smashes all the idols except for the biggest one. And he takes the hammer that he uses and he puts it on the feet, right in front of this big idol. Heard this story before?
Yeah.
So his dad comes back and says, well, I just smashed all the idols. And Abraham said, I didn't do it. He did. And his dad's really upset. He's like, what are you talking about? He's an idol. He can't do anything. And Abraham's like, well, if he can't do anything, why are you praying to him? Our rabbis come up with reasons, come up with explanations to help us understand why we have what's in the Torah. Did that actually happen? Well, probably not. Rabbis are writing a couple thousand years later, or this, that, or the other. But it does help to teach us a really important lesson. Well, the thing is, those laws weren't written yet. but here's the thing: is that you do have ideas and notions, right? That I'm blanking on the king's name. He's in like the early chapters of Genesis, and he was considered to be the king. I can't believe I'm forgetting his name. Huh? No, not Melchizedek. It was, what's his name? No, you're way too recent. This is like way, way back in the early days of Genesis. He's like, he in the Torah talks about him as a fighter or a hunter. I don't remember his name. I'll come up with it eventually. So he basically is seen as being the king. And there's this idea, rabbis tell the story just like in Daniel, where it's thrown into a fiery furnace and he survives, right? Like there's that kind of a notion. And so you have these stories that get told that are part of rabbinic tradition and that help to explain in a way that everybody can understand, right? Why Abraham would have been chosen. But it's not just about why Abraham would have been chosen. When did the rabbis live? The early rabbis were living at a time when idolatry was very popular. And so it was also a story to tell people, just like Abraham, we can have a backbone. We don't have to convert to Romanism. We don't have to allow their idols in our holy places. Right? Think about that for a moment. It was a message for the people of the time, as well as an explanation of why Abraham was so awesome. Right? So these kinds of things are a part of rabbinic literature, rabbinic teachings. And it really does have an impact on how we understand the Bible. Everything that we look at in Jewish tradition, everything that we look at is done through the lens of rabbinic interpretation. You can take a look at the Bible and you can say, this is what it says in the Bible, but so did anybody really take their kid out and stone them? Well, so what does our rabbis talk about that? There's one rabbi in particular who says that, well, to be a rebellious child, you have to have done A and B and C and D and EF all the way down to Z. Like you have to do all these things, and then ends up saying no one has ever done all of those things, and nobody ever will. Right? I mean, so you have it basically, we took what was in the Bible. He doesn't say that what's in the Torah is wrong, but just says that there's never going to be a situation where this would be the right thing to do. Right? So this is the kind of notion, this is the kind of idea that when it comes to rabbinic teaching and rabbinic interpretation, that this is the ways that our rabbis start to think about these things. And we'll talk about different rabbinic works. We'll talk about the Talmud. We'll talk about other aspects, right, of rabbinic writings, different commentaries. But it's also important to know that our rabbinic interpretations also contradict each other. They say different things. Like Nachmanides will look at what Rashi wrote and say, well, and Rashi is wrong. This is what it really means. 2 Jews, 3 opinions. I'm not joking when I talk about that, right? Like, we disagree about everything for the same verse. Sometimes rabbinic commentators will share the same kind of teaching, right? The same kind of, they can say like, and I learned from this rabbi, right? And they'll quote one another. And sometimes they just go in a completely different direction. Which one is right? What time? What age? What are you going through in life at the moment? Because there are times when I will learn from Rashi, and there are times when I will learn from Nachmanides, and there are times when I will learn from Sforno, and there are times, right? There's all of these different rabbis. Those are real people who wrote real commentaries. And they were living, right, maybe in France or maybe in Spain or maybe, right, like they were living in a specific community at a given time. And they were responding to life as it existed, as they saw it. What is Rabbinic Judaism about? It's about responding to the life that we are living. It has to remain relevant. Right? Because if our understanding of God, if our understanding of religion, if our understanding of our tradition isn't relevant to our lives, then it's a lot harder to want to keep doing it. And Rabbinic Judaism has and continues to ensure that Judaism is relevant, responding to what exists currently. Right? Like the sermon and the teaching that I gave this past weekend, I talked about how in our society today, we judge everything. Everything. And so we turn to the words of the Torah about how justice shall you pursue, and understanding that in different ways, based on what was happening in our world today, based on the society that we live in today. The importance of a rabbinic text telling a story about 2 boats, that if they come to a narrow part in the river, right, that if one doesn't allow the other one to go first, if there isn't a sense of compromise, then you're going to end up with 2 boats at the bottom of the ocean or at the river. But when you feel that you are righteous and you are just and your cause is just, you're not willing to let somebody else go first. And in our political society today, that has led to a lot of boats on the bottom of the river, right? Like, we have to be able to apply the teachings and understand our teachings in terms of how we currently look at it. But I take a rabbinic story that was from the Talmud, that was written over 1,500 years ago, and it relates so well to our situation today. Right? And that's what Reform Judaism, that's what Judaism as a whole is. That's our goal. That's why Rabbinic Judaism is so important. And so let me just give you a word about the readings, because this is the first time that I've got actual readings. So we didn't have that last time. And so basically the readings will prepare you for next time, right? And so in Telushkin, I'm starting you off with the Bible. We're going to start to go through the Bible. And we're going to start to go through biblical stories and understand them from a Jewish perspective. For example, little teaser. We don't have original sin. Not a Jewish concept, not a Jewish thing. It exists in other traditions, obviously. It's not a Jewish thing. So how do we understand the Adam and Eve story? So the Telushkin piece, and the Telushkin's book is going to be really kind of like the main, if you only get one of the books, get the Telushkin. It's really the most comprehensive. But the Kurtzer, Telushkin's a modern Orthodox rabbi. Kurtzer is, it's Kurtzer and Hoffman, actually. It's from a Reform Jewish perspective. I want you to see different perspectives. That's important, right? And so they usually they kind of focus on the same kind of piece. And then for 223 and 247, those are not page numbers. The way that Telushkin has hundreds of topics. And so this is Telushkin is that's why it's a number sign instead of a page number. It's the topic number that you go from.
Is there a store where they walk in and buy these?
You can find some of them. You can find some of them.
Close to where I live, downtown Fort Worth.
So you can find some of them at Half Price Books. You can find some of them at Borders. The easiest place is Amazon, for better or for worse.
Amazon won't let me in.
Okay.
I can't order on Amazon. I've tried since I got back in December, and I would never be able to get in.
Okay. And then we do have some that are in our library that you can also borrow, because it's a library, and so you can borrow books from it. And I can talk to me after class, and I can help you out with that.
I just didn't know if I could get them quick enough to.
Yeah, we can take a look. I'm almost positive we've got the Telushkin in there. Yeah, it's possible. It's absolutely possible. Sorry, not Borders. I mean, Barnes and Noble.
Are you talking about a store I can walk into, or?
Yeah, both.
Because I ordered. I don't know for anything.
Yeah, between Half Price Books and Barnes and Noble, they should be able to get most of them. There's one book on prayer that's much harder to find. The book on prayer. Yeah, B'chol Levavcha is much harder to find, but almost everything else you should be able to.
Two of them I can find at a place where book outlets. I mean, which two they are.
But you can't walk into this place, but Art Scroll has.
These are not Art Scroll books. Art Scroll is a publisher that is really an Orthodox publishing
So
arm.
which one was the one that's hard to find?
B'chol Levavcha. We're not going to get to that until the end of the class. So.
I can get these two at the book outlet real cheap, but I don't know how quick I can get them.
Again, we've got a library, and so we'll take a look. I don't know if we have the Kurtzer, but I know we have the Telushkin, and that's, again, probably the most important one, singular book to have access to. So, all right, everybody, I will see you next week. We do have class next week, and I think after that we're going to be on a little break so I can have time for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. But take a look at the schedule that you have in the syllabus, and Pamela will print that up and give that to you. If you need it and you don't have it, email me and tell me, and I will send it to you in soft copy. Everybody who is out there in listening to this on the internet, I hope you're having a good time, and have a great day. Be well.